Thank you for coming out this evening, and I look forward to a good discussion. The topic I want to talk about this evening is one which, the more I read on the topic, the more it becomes compelling to me, at any rate, that the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably among the least complicated, least controversial in the world today. The consensus on the historical record, the consensus on the human rights record, the consensus on the legal diplomatic record, basically the past, the present, and the future, is quite broad, and one can almost say it's remarkable. And now when I made that initial statement, some people laughed, because obviously it's quite at odds with the perception of the conflict when we enter into the public arena, where we're told how complex, how controversial, how intricate this Israel-Palestine conflict is, and what a tough nut it is to crack. I was on the way here reading a new book by one of the negotiators at Camp David, a fellow named Aaron David Miller, and he writes his account on the Camp David negotiations in 2000 and basically the whole period of the 1990s up to the present. And he goes on at some great length about how complicated this question is and how nobody would want to tackle it. But I don't think that's what the record shows. The record shows it's not very complicated at all. And then the obvious question arises, if what I'm saying is true, and the burden of my remarks this evening is to demonstrate what I'm saying is true, if what I'm saying is true, then how do you account for all the controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict when you enter the public arena? And the main argument I'm going to make this evening is that most of that controversy is contrived. It's artificial, it's fake, and it's designed, its purpose is to divert people's attention from what the record actually shows and to sow confusion about that record. Well, let me begin with a fairly straightforward, accessible, and recent illustration. In July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, it rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. Some of you who are familiar with the topic will perhaps know the conclusion the World Court reached, namely that the wall Israel is building is illegal, that it has to be dismantled, and that Israel has to pay compensation for the damages wrought. In fact, that was probably the least significant aspect of the World Court advisory opinion. And the reason why is this. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo of this thing called the peace process, one aspect of this peace process is what's called the final status negotiations. And that basically means those aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict which are said to be so controversial, complex, and intricate that they have to be deferred, put off until the last stage of negotiations, because if you start with these issues, the whole process will break down. So the usual sequence is to claim we first need confidence-building measures, another catchphrase of this thing called the peace process. First we need confidence-building measures, and then we can proceed to those tough final status negotiations. Well, it so happens that before the World Court, the International Court of Justice, could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel has been building, they first had to rule on nearly all the final status questions. The final status questions are usually said to consist of four. Number one, borders. What are the legitimate borders of the state of Israel? What would be the legitimate borders of a Palestinian state? Number two, settlements. The status of the settlements that Israel is building in the occupied Palestinian territories. Number three, Jerusalem, the status of East Jerusalem. And number four, the question of the refugees. Well, it so happens that the World Court had to rule on the first three questions, borders, settlements, and Jerusalem, before it could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel is building, for reasons which will be obvious to everybody in the audience. If the borders of Israel extended all the way into the West Bank, tentatively or factually, then obviously the wall would be legal, or tentatively legal. For reasons that every property owner in this room knows, if you have a quarrel with your neighbor, you're allowed to build a fence or construct a fence along the border with your neighbor, but you're obviously not allowed to build a fence around your neighbor's swimming pool or garage. These aren't particularly complicated questions of law, and the same principle applies here. So we have to first know where the border is before we can determine the legality of the wall that's being built. And the same principle applies to the settlements, because as it happens, the wall that's being built takes what the court calls a sinuous route that goes around the settlements. Well, the settlements are legal, that's fine. But if the settlements are the equivalent of your neighbor's swimming pool, well, obviously questions arise. And so the World Court had to proceed to answer these questions. Allegedly, and you'll bear with me to the point of tedium, I hope, but because it keeps being said, these questions are so controversial. They're so complicated. Well, what did the World Court decide? Number one, on the question of borders. The International Court said there's a fundamental principle of international law. It's stated in a preambular paragraph of the famous UN Resolution 242, namely the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Basic principle of international law, said to be anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, Israel, which conquered the West Bank and Gaza during the June 1967 war, it acquired them by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to them. Why? Because it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And so the World Court rules Israel has no title to any territory outside its pre-June 1967 border. And it's very clear it refers to the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory, capital O, capital P, capital T, and the abbreviation is usually OPT. I mention it only because it's considered now a commonplace. If you open up any human rights report in the occupied territories, you will see everywhere they are referred to as occupied Palestinian territory, paren OPT. It's a non-controversial question. They were acquired by Israel through war. Israel has no title to them. These are occupied Palestinian territory. They are not, as is often said in the public life, these are not disputed territories. These are occupied Palestinian territories. No dispute about the matter of ownership.